There was an ash storm on the horizon. Ethan was pretty sure he could make it back to Safe House in good time if he left now, but he had spent hours uncovering this collection of old engines with his leaf blower, and if he didn't get the parts he needed now, then they'd be buried again. So he got on with trying to lever out the old carburetor he needed, and try not to think too much about the black wall rushing towards him, while of course keeping a careful eye on it. He had seen what happened to people who got caught in an ash storm. If the lightning didn't get them, the smothering, choking black dust would. Even with a mask on, nobody could last long. It was like being buried alive and drowned at the same time. There had been a time, so his grandparents said, when the world hadn't been like this, when the hills were green and the skies were blue, and the seas were a sort of green-grey rather than black sludge. Then the earth had been destroyed by humanity's greed and arrogance, which was an odd way of putting it to Ethan's ears, because the earth was clearly still here, and he was living proof of that. He also wasn't sure why they'd made a point of explaining in detail how the wars and the ecological disasters their generation had caused had turned the earth from a virtual paradise into this. If he was in their position, he'd keep as quiet as possible about that. After all, whenever they called him out on screwing up, he could just say, well, at least I didn't destroy the world. Not that there was really much call for discipline from the senior figures in the safe house. Either you did what the old folks told you, or you died. And if you didn't die, then there was no need to listen to them in the first place. At least, that was how Ethan saw it. For example, the older generation had told him that when he saw an ash storm coming, he should return to the safe house immediately, drop whatever he was doing and get back as fast as possible. But based on past experience, he was fairly sure he had enough time to get a few more parts before he had to head back. It'd still leave himself a comfortable margin of error, though. He might be cocky, but he wasn't stupid. He glanced back at Safe House, that little unconscious twitch a lot of the people living there had, making sure they could still see their home, making sure it was still there, that they hadn't strayed any further than they meant to. Because if you went too far or got lost, well, no one survived the outside for long. It was a matter of when, not if. Ethan hadn't needed the old folks to tell him that. He'd seen enough corpses brought back when he was growing up. Charred corpses, struck by lightning, and ash-caked corpses, smothered to death, and broken up corpses who'd fallen through an old roof or had a wall collapse on them. All people he knew, because in the safe house he knew everyone. There were only a few hundred people left around here. Only a few hundred people left in the entire world, for all Ethan knew. Although admittedly, beyond the few square miles around Safe House, he didn't know much. For example, he didn't know why sometimes they found corpses with bits missing. Sometimes the old folks muttered about vultures, but he didn't know what that was about either. The picture books in the schoolroom had pictures of vultures, but he'd never seen any around here. Hell, it was rare that he saw any birds at all. There was a noise off to his right, coming from a pile of half-rusted cars. This whole salvage yard had been in an advanced state of decay long before the apocalypse hit. There shouldn't be anything here. Hello? Ethan called out, because the most likely explanation was that it was someone from Safe House come to check up on him, make sure he got back before the ash storm swept over them. No one answered. It wasn't unheard of for animals to pass by every now and then. Mostly small things, a rat maybe, or a small bird. Every so often there would be a dog gone feral. They were good scavengers and they knew how to live around humans and what remained of their civilization. And several years ago he thought he saw a deer, although everyone in Safe House agreed he had imagined that. There was that sound again. Something making the metal creak and groan, and what sounded far too much like footsteps. Hello? Is anyone there? Ethan called out again. Silence, apart from the wind that was rapidly starting to pick up. He looked out towards the horizon again. The ash storm was approaching fast. He still had time, but maybe not as much as he'd thought. He glanced back to Safe House again. The vanes on the snorkel towers were all pointing the same direction, definitely a bad sign. The snorkel towers were there so that if Safehouse got buried in ash, they could still breathe. And the vanes were there to make sure the vents always faced away from the wind, so they didn't get choked up. When the winds were low, they faced anywhere, but the higher the winds got, it was definitely time to get back. Ethan packed the carburetor safely in his pack, then swung the leaf blower over his shoulder and started off at a jog. It was usually better not to move too fast, or you would disturb the ash and end up covered in it, and breathing in things you shouldn't. But with a mask it wouldn't be too bad, and in a pinch, it was better to get a little dirty than a little dead. He was still fairly confident he could make it with plenty of time to spare. It wasn't a straight route home because of all the junk piled up in the scrapyard, but he knew the area pretty well, and he knew the safe routes out of the yard and back onto the road. Then the ground gave way beneath him, and he just had time to cry out before he fell. 1/2 meter or so. He was an idiot. He had been blowing ash around all morning with a leaf blower, and he'd forgotten that it covered several of the marker flags that were there to warn him of unstable ground. In this case, he'd walked over the heavily rusted roof of an old truck, and his legs had gone straight through. Luckily, he hadn't broken anything, or cut himself, which he could easily have done on the jagged metal. He sighed, muttering under his breath about what a moron he was, and started feeling around for something solid to brace himself on so he could push himself up again. His glass found metal, and he heaved himself up. Or at least, he tried to. The truck was filled with ash, and probably other detritus that had collected there over the years. It was exerting a suction force on his legs, to the point where he couldn't pull them free. He tried again to pull himself out, and he barely moved. Okay, this was bad, but he wasn't dead yet, he just had to think. Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his chest, and he tried not to start hyperventilating. The last thing he needed now was a mouthful of ash. Think. There must be some way out of this. The black wall on the horizon was a lot closer now. He didn't have time to radio for help. The storm was close enough to disrupt communications now anyway. Even as he watched, lightning fought across the billowing ash clouds. He also didn't have time to dig around in his pack and put together some ingenious little grappling device or whatever. There were no other options. Desperately, Ethan started to scrape away the ash he was half buried in with his hands. He had only been doing this for a moment when he heard a noise. His head snapped round. "Hey, if there's someone out there, I need help." Again, nothing but the sound of the rising wind. "Please, help! Help!" For 30 seconds or so, nothing happened, and Ethan was just about convinced that he had been shouting at empty air. Then a shadow flickered and caught his eye. A figure detached itself from the mound of ash piled up against the nearest stack of old cars. It was wearing a mottled grey cloak that blended in near perfectly with the ash itself, and it was only when it lifted its hood that Ethan was sure there was anything there at all. Yellow eyes in a beaked face stared out at him. No, not eyes, and not a beak. They were goggles, and the beak wasn't a beak but some kind of breathing apparatus. Ethan had enough mechanical knowledge to see it was some sort of combination air filter and oxygen mask. There were filter pads visible through the slits at the tip of the beak, but he could also see a hose leading to the tank on the figure's back. Whoever this was, they took a lot more precautions against the ash than the people of Safehouse did. They also had much better tech. Hey, can you help me? Please, I need some help over here." The cloaked figure hesitated, then took a step towards him. However, as it did so, another almost identical figure detached itself from the shadows and quickly strode over. The first one looked at its companion, then took another step towards Ethan, but the newcomer put out an arm to block their path. They stared each other down for a moment. Please, get me out of here." The second beaked figure shook their head. The first one looked at their partner, then at Ethan, then back at their partner. They shuffled towards Ethan a little, but the second one stepped in front of them. There was a moment as they looked at each other, beaked faces inches apart. Then the first figure turned and retreated. No, No, please don't leave me. Please. Please. The second figure turned back to Ethan, and although the mask carried no expression, the look it gave him was somehow clear. I'm sorry, but this is the way things are. Then it followed its companion back to the stack of cars, on the lee side, where the winds of the storm wouldn't be so fierce, in the middle of the scrapyard where lightning would likely strike one of the many other, taller piles of metal. Now that Ethan looked closely, there were at least 3 or 4 other beat figures waiting there. With their oxygen tanks, the storm wouldn't be a danger to them like it was to him. One last time, he tried calling out to them, but the winds were already picking up and howling through the towers of twisted steel, and his pleas were carried away on the rapidly darkening air. Not that it mattered. They didn't need to hear him to see the panic as he tried one last time to haul himself free, even though it was already too late. 6 pairs of yellow goggles watching him from the thickening shadows as the storm swept over them all. The search party found Ethan the next day. It wasn't hard. Everyone knew he'd been working at the scrapyard when the storm hit. They found his body laying right there, on top of the newly deposited layer of ash. The corpse was missing a kidney, part of the liver, and both lungs, as well as the corneas and the right arm below the elbow. A basic once-over by the medic confirmed that all the surgically precise injuries had been inflicted post-mortem. From the ash deposits in his nostrils, it was most likely that he was suffocated by the storm. The search party wrapped him up and hefted the bundle up onto their shoulders, ready for the long walk back to safe house. There would be a short ceremony, then he'd go into compost, in preparation for recycling back into the hydroponic system. Someone muttered something about the vultures, but only under their breath. There was nothing they could do, and no one liked to think about it too much. In the end, it was only a few kilos of compost that they were losing, and presumably whoever or whatever was out there had better uses for it than they did. Whoever they were, they hadn't killed Ethan. His own stupidity had done that, like everyone had said it would one day. No sense spitting into the wind. The world was nothing but problems, and they had plenty more pressing ones to deal with. Time to get back, and no time to wait. There was already another ash storm on the horizon.